Hi everyone, my name is Alessandro Ferrari from the University of Zurich, and today I'm presenting the paper Fiscal and Currency Unions with Default and Exit. The paper is joint work with Ramon and Chima Simpson-Bell from the IMF, hence the usual disclaimer here applies. So the general problem we're interested in this paper is the one of economic unions that are subject to member states potentially leaving or threatening to do so. And you can think of the cases of Brexit or the somewhat common political discourse about countries that want to leave the Eurozone. We want to study these kind of problems in more formally by thinking about such unions as long-term contracts or dynamic contracts that are subject to participation constraints. And what we want to study more specifically is two kinds of unions for this paper. One is a set of countries that have a common fiscal policy but retain independent monetary policies. And in another case, what I will mostly referring to as a monetary union is a set of countries that have a common fiscal and monetary policy. And with these unions in mind, we want to ask whether such contracts are feasible and sustainable, whether we can say something about how they compare between the two of them and compare to some outside option that I'll describe later. And we also want to think about more generally about how fiscal and monetary policy interact in these kind of settings. So the literature we built on recently saw the contribution of Ferrari and Werning in their 2017 paper about the value of fiscal transfers in currency unions. And we basically borrowed their setting, but used the framework, the theoretical machinery of Marcet and Marimon to think about participation a little more thoroughly. So jumping right into the model, in our setting, time is discrete and infinite, and we have two countries. The two countries are identical, which is a slight departure from what we typically see in dynamic contracting problems, in which one agent is typically a principal and the other is an agent, or for example, in the paper by Ramon and Arpad, where one is risk neutral and the other is risk averse, or where one is patient and the other is impatient. So we're going to assume full symmetry. The only source of stochasticity in this model is going to be on the endowment of tradables, which is going to follow some Markov process. And up until the very, very end of the presentation, I will assume that there is no aggregate risk, so that the total endowment of tradable goods is constant across states. As a side note here, the setting we have, because of the no aggregate risk assumption, it's kind of far from what the optimal currency literature typically assumes, because we know from the literature that the cost of giving up monetary policy independence typically grows as countries have less and less synchronized business cycle, in that the one-size-fits-all policy becomes worse and worse. Now, jumping into the actual setting, our agents consume tradable goods, non-tradable goods, and leisure, and alpha is a parameter that governs openness, but throughout I'll basically almost always set it to 1. The expenditure side of the budget constraint is just given by expenditure on consumption. Note here, as I'll discuss in the next slide, the dependence of on yesterday's state on the price of non-tradables, and that's because there's going to be a nominal friction coming in here. And the income side of the budget constraint is just the value of the endowment, the labor income, and potential profits. The non-tradable side of the economy is extremely standard. There's a continuum of monopolistically competitive producers, and they have a linear technology in labor. Their varieties are aggregated via CES, into the consumption bundle that consumers then buy. These producers are subject to predetermined pricing, meaning that they pick the price of today, knowing at most the state yesterday, before the state today realizes. And this will basically give rise to suboptimal pricing. We also assume the standard labor subsidy here to eliminate the static inefficiency of monopolistic competition. So our problem can basically be summarized by this planner problem, in which we want to maximize the weighted value of the two countries' utilities, weighted by some Pareto weight, subject to resource constraint, the fact that transfer needs to be zero-sum, and the participation constraints, plus a bunch of very standard market clearing conditions. Now, the participation constraint just says that the value inside the contract on the left-hand side must be at least as good as the value of some outside option I'll describe in the next two slides. As a side note here, if we were to think about the Ramsey veil of ignorance approach to this, we would just set mu I as to a half and just kind of forget about it. Now the outside options. As the title kind of gives away, we want to think about what happens when countries could potentially leave the contract, so the fiscal or the monetary union, and potentially also default. So the outside option is going to be described by a max operator over the values of leaving and repaying the liabilities that were accrued inside the contract, or leaving and defaulting on them. Now, what are those liabilities? Well, inside these contracts, you have state contingent transfers that, and it is possible for countries to build large liabilities positions if, for example, the country is consistently unlucky. And we take exactly those liabilities described here and assume that the country is basically owes that to the rest of the union upon leaving. Now, basically, more specifically, you can think of the outside option as described by an Arellano, a too-good version of an Arellano 2008 economy, in that if the country chooses to leave and repay, they just have access to this one-period non-contingent debt. And if instead they choose to leave and default, they pay some output cost upon defaulting, and with some probability theta, they get to go back to financial markets and start with a clean slate with zero liabilities. So given this outside option, now let me discuss for a moment what monetary policy does in this model. So in general, because of predetermination of prices, there will be a wedge, a labor wedge, basically, such that the real wage in this economy will not be one, which would be the optimal allocation in this setting. So what we call a labor wedge here is this kappa. And it's easy to show that an independent monetary authority basically will just have as an optimal policy putting such wedge to zero. So basically taking the economy back to the efficient level of non-tradable consumption and labor. Now, in general, independent monetary policy can do that. The monetary policy here is very powerful, and it's able to do it, to take the economy back to kind of first best allocation of the non-tradable or the domestic side of the economy. Clearly, it is not going to be possible for a monetary union to do so. And the reason is simply that the two shocks are negatively correlated, like I described at the beginning, and therefore a common monetary policy is going to be a poorly designed tool to solve both countries' wedges. So then we take a common central banker stance, and we say that it maximizes a half-half average of the country-specific welfares. And by governing the area-wide exchange rate, the policy it will pick is one that clearly and intuitively puts to zero some weighted average of the country-specific wedges. What is interesting here is that the weights are proportional to the marginal utility of consumption. And this basically implies that, as we say here, monetary policy for a common currency union has a Rawlsian flavor in which the country that currently is consuming the least gets a higher weight on their wedge. Now, with this setup in mind, then what we do is we want to ask whether fiscal and monetary union can be sustained, how one should design transfers optimally. We also want to ask whether we can achieve first best given the limited enforcement frictions. And here, it's important to note that, as you probably figured out by now, we do not model any benefit from monetary policy coordination or having a common monetary policy. And therefore, it cannot be that the fiscal and monetary union can do better than the fiscal union with independent monetary policies. And we do so on purpose with the idea of characterizing kind of a lower bound. And I'll discuss this again at the end when I talk about extensions. So practically, to solve the model, we had to rewrite it as a saddle point problem, as Albert and Ramon show in their econometrica paper. It's fine to call it recent. So saddle point problem here is maximizing the value of the utilities of the countries weighted by some Pareto weight, but at the same time trying to minimize basically this set of lambdas, which are the multipliers in front of the participation constraints of the country. And this, sorry, I forgot that lambda is also going to be important part of the law of motion of the Pareto weights. Now, we can define a co-state in this problem that is the relative Pareto weight that basically says, given the size of the pie, what is the splitting rule? And importantly, here is the law of motion of the relative Pareto weight. Now, note that as lambda 1 and 2 are the multipliers on the participation constraint, basically the relative Pareto weight will only change between yesterday and today, or today and tomorrow, if either participation constraint is binding. And in particular, if my participation constraint is binding, my Pareto weight will go up. So clearly, there's a key difference here between the fiscal and the monetary union, because as you see from the state dependence, in a fiscal union, the relative Pareto weight only depends on today's state, whereas in the monetary union, it also depends on yesterday's, and that's because the monetary union, so basically because the nominal frictions have a bite here. The monetary authority are not able to kill them, basically. So now, with these concepts in mind, what we are after is a set of optimal transfer policies, which we back out by having the planners pick the allocation and basically inverting the difference between consumption and endowment so that we get the transfer policy. Now, before I jump into the results, let me give you a definition, which is going to be important in informing the results. I'll show you in the next couple of slides. So the definition is basically characterizing the kind of steady states that we can have here. There's a first kind of steady state that we can, these economic features, that one we call perfectly sharing steady state, or constant relative Pareto weight steady state, that basically says that there exists a relative Pareto weight at which both countries never have binding participation constraints. So basically, for any possible states, both countries are happy to stay in the union if that's how they split the surplus. A second kind of steady state is one in which basically that's not true. So that it is possible to have a feasible or sustainable contract, but we do not have perfect risk sharing. So basically what happens here is that in some states, I will be unhappy with the deal I get. And in some other states, the other country will be unhappy with the deal that they are getting. So basically what will happen here is that we have a cycle. Anytime my participation constraint binds, my relative Pareto weight will be increased, and vice versa. So we'll forever go through kind of this motion. And because the relative Pareto weights move, so will consumption, and therefore we call it an imperfect risk sharing steady state. Now, an important result here that is common also to the paper by O'Clair and Rogley is that in this setting, the cost of giving up independent monetary policy is proportional to the residual volatility of tradable consumption. And if we are able to have a solution or a steady state in which tradable consumption doesn't move anymore, then it's as if we're in a deterministic economy. And if we're in a deterministic economy, then monetary policy is able to close all wedges at the same time. So the corollary to this is that if we can attain a full risk sharing steady state, then it must be that the value of a fiscal union with independent monetary policy is exactly the same as the value of a fiscal and monetary union. And the reason is simply that in full risk sharing steady states, because the economy is as if deterministic, nominal rigidities do not have a bite here. Now, the converse to this result is obviously that if we're not in such a steady state, so that we have residual fluctuations in tradable consumption, then it must be, and this is, remember, because we do not model any direct value of having a common monetary policy, then it must be that the fiscal union with independent monetary policy is strictly better than the fiscal and monetary union. Now, the next question is what basically governs the likelihood that we have full risk sharing steady state? Well, basically, it has to do with the intensity or how much of a bite the limited enforcement friction has. And clearly, anything that will make the outside option go down will kind of do the trick. So anything like a higher default cost or more risk given risk aversion or more risk aversion given risk, because inside the contract there is stiff contingency, which the agents value a lot, will bring us closer to a first best or full risk sharing steady state, and therefore reduce the cost of giving up independent monetary policy. Now, the question then becomes, how much does this matter quantitatively? And we take the values that Ramon, Arpad, and co-authors have calibrated in another paper of theirs. And we simulate this economy. And what I'm plotting here are steady state moments for the outside option economy, the fiscal union with independent monetary policy, and the fiscal and monetary union. So the first thing I want to flag is that, as you can see here, this is the volatility of tradable consumption, which is not zero. So therefore, we're not in a full risk sharing steady state. Now, it immediate by theorem 1 that the fiscal union must be strictly better than the monetary union. However, as you can see from all moments, it is extremely slightly better. There is the volatility of consumption is basically the same. The correlation is also basically the same. And the reason is ex post intuitive, which is the following. If the fiscal planner is able to do its job well, meaning that compared to the outside option economy, there's a sizable reduction in the volatility of consumption. And because the cost of giving up monetary policy, independent monetary policy depends, or it's proportional to the volatility of tradable consumption, then if such volatility is relatively small because the fiscal planner did its job, then giving up monetary policy, independent monetary policy, is not very costly, as you can see from the welfare comparisons. So I basically gave you exactly this intuition here. There's one bit of the intuition that I can add on, which is actually the planner is also quite sophisticated in taking into account how bad nominal rigidities are for these countries. And what I'm showing you here is basically a graph that takes the relative Pareto weight in a monetary and a fiscal union and plots here consumption of the country. And the only thing I want to show here is that while the fiscal union just has this flat consumption path depending on the Pareto weight, the relative Pareto weight, the monetary union planner, so this is a fiscal planner choice, actually depends on the history. You see that if I go from state one to state one, or if I come from state 5 to go to state 1, the actual consumption changes. And that is because the fiscal planner is realizing that moving a lot between states actually has a higher cost in terms of nominal rigidities, and therefore is going to make the country that has a large transition better off. So I'm running over time, so I'll just mention the extensions that we have and are working on. The first one is one that breaks this full stabilization result by breaking the fact that the cost of losing independent monetary policy is directly proportional to the volatility of tradable consumption. And the last one, which is the very obvious next step, is to include a direct gain from monetary policy coordination, so that basically we have a setting in which monetary and fiscal unions can be better than fiscal unions with independent monetary policy. So I will stop here just by saying that what we have is a model in which we think about the fiscal and monetary policy interactions in unions taking into account participation constraints. And I look forward to our discussions during the conference.